Hello, and welcome to this presentation on how to use the Assessment Tool Generator, or ATG, to design and develop assessment tools. Now, here is the landing page for Skills Assessment Australia at saa.edu.au. And after you've logged in, you'll see that these menu items appear on the top right-hand side. So let's click on Training. Now, what we see here is the first of 3 pages that you'll navigate through in order to design and develop your assessment tool. The first thing that we're going to do here is load a new unit of competency, and we enter the unit code in this field here. Now, there's only really one restriction on the units, and that's to use a unit in the new unit format. That is, you can't use a unit that's got a suffix at the end. So for example, BSB CMM 401A, A for alpha, that's in the old unit format and that can't be used. BSB CMM 401 does not have an A, so that would be in the new unit format. Now, if you're studying Unit TAEASS502 Design and Develop Assessment Tools, then your main assessment task is to create 3 complete tools based on units of competency. And if you need some guidance as to which units to select, if you click on this hyperlink here, you'll see that the FSK training package is loaded. And if we scroll down to the units, you can see we've got about 100 nice and simple units. These are quite short, simple, that we would recommend that you consider using for your tools. So let's go ahead here, we'll choose one at random, FSK DIG 003. Now you'll notice that the training package in which this unit resides and the release number are automatically populated. And you can use them as default or override as necessary. If you've already worked on other units and saved them, then there'll be a list here that includes each of those units that you've previously loaded. You can click on one of those to resume working on them, or in this case, we're going to click on Load New Unit. So what the Assessment Tool Generator, what the ATG has done now is it's extracted all of the relevant components from the unit of competency at training.gov.au and has populated the tables below. Now, if you require some additional help, we've got a link here to some student resources that includes a help file, this video, and so on. We've got a control here that you can click, which will load the unit of competency that we're dealing with. Okay, if you wanted to refer to the unit, and some help file links. Okay, so what are the tasks from here? So the tasks are basically that you have to edit the unit's compliance matrix to specify how you're going to assess using the 5 accepted assessment instrument or methods, how you're going to assess each of the assessable items within the unit. We've got guidance here as to what those methods are: questioning, observation, portfolio, production, and third party. And these are the normal 5 that you will see, and these are consistent with ASQA's Guide to Developing Assessment Tools. We've got 2 additional fields as well, noted in plan, and this is used when the unit item isn't going to be assessed within an assessment instrument, but you want to discuss it in your plan. And an example of that is assessor qualifications. You would simply note in your plan how your organisation's in-house processes ensure that only suitably qualified assessors are used to apply the instrument. And secondly, inherent in unit. And I'll show you an example below of inherent in unit. And you've got various controls to manipulate the compliance matrix if you need them. So let's have a look at the assessment plan. Firstly, we've got the application, and that describes what the unit is about. And you want to make sure that you've got a fairly good grasp on that, because you're going to have to create an assessment scenario that's consistent with the objectives of this unit. And here we have the compliance matrix. Now you'll note that all of the headings are context sensitive, so There's a definition of what the questioning instrument is for, observations, and so on. Now, we talked about these last two columns, noted in plan and inherited in unit. Now, a noted in plan, you'll notice that if we scroll down, all of the assessment conditions from the unit, right, are automatically pre-populated with noted in plan. And the reason for that is, as I said before, these are items that they need to be addressed within your plan, but they don't need to be explicitly assessed within an instrument. So that's why these are noted in plan. Now, of course, they're not. It's not set. You can override these, and if you want to assess something within here, you certainly have the ability to do so if you desire. Now, let's have a look at inherited in unit. When would we use that? Okay, well, if we scroll to the foundation skills, we'll see there's only one foundation skill here. And it says, foundation skills essential to performance are explicit in the performance criteria of the unit, or the PCs. Well, in other words, we're assessing all of these PCs here. Right? So do we need to assess that item explicitly in one of the instruments? Well, clearly no. So this would be a perfect candidate for selecting inherit in unit. So let's go through these PCs. Now, I'm not going to create a plan that's logically correct. What I'm going to do is just assign items randomly, just to demonstrate what happens when we go to the next stage, which is to create the assessment instruments. Now, I've populated some random data. I've made some selections as to how we're going to assess each of these items, that is, by which assessment instrument or method we're going to use. And now what I want to do is review what I've put in. And what the ATG does is it reviews your selections against about a dozen common errors and warnings, and it flags when there's a problem. So let's have a look at what's happened here. Okay, so for PC 3.1, it's a warning because it's shaded in yellow. And it says, accessible item is assessed by more than one instruments. Accessible items are typically assessed by just one method. And if you've got a one-to-many mapping, in other words, one assessment requirement is mapped to several instruments, then it's often indicative of a problem. Now, it's a warning because, you know what, you can ignore that. If there's something that you really want it to be assessed in, let's say both by questioning and an observation, you can certainly do that. And you can just accept that there's a warning here, save your work, and then generate the instruments based on this. Same for an error, which is in red. The ATG will allow you to generate instruments even if your compliance matrix has got things that it considers an error. Now, let's have a look at this error. It says that error 1. The accessible item has not been assigned an assessment method. In other words, a check mark is missing. And indeed, if we look at this row, nothing's been selected for it. So we're going to assess, we're going to add an assessment method for these items. Likewise, we've got some red E1s here that we were missing checklist items. And there we go. All right, so that's our compliance matrix finished, where we've basically divided up the accessible items within the unit, and we've decided by which method we're going to assess them. But there's still a little bit more assessment plan content that we need to specify. Now, we could save the work now and move on to the instruments, but the plan that's then generated subsequently would be missing these fields. So let's have a look at it. Firstly, target group summary. We want to summarize who the target group is that we're going to be applying this instrument to. And we've provided some sample text, a description of what this means, and some sample text in here. You need to edit this text to reflect the context or the scenario that you're going to be generating for this tool. What's the purpose and the context of it? Again, we've provided some sample text which you need to modify based upon your assessment context. Now, this field here is the notes from the compliance matrix. And what we mean is, from our compliance matrix, wherever we had noted in plan, right, those items are going to be transferred into our notes. And what we need to do is edit this field to describe how each of these assessment conditions are satisfied by your instruments or by your assessment process. And we gave the example before. If they're for the, let's see, we have all of these relate to assessor qualifications, and we would make a note to say that, to describe how we would ensure that assessors have these mandatory qualifications in order to assess this unit. Assessment methods and instruments, we want to describe how and when your instruments will be applied, and we've given some examples here, but obviously you have to modify this to reflect the sequence and the requirements for applying the instruments that you've selected from the compliance matrix. Applicable industry or workplace standards. Now again, if there are none, then you would simply write no standards or requirements exist. However, if you were doing a unit that had some requirements, for example, RSA, the RSA unit, responsible service of alcohol, that ties into lots of external requirements. So you'd probably make a note of them here. And there are several units where that might apply. Now, reasonable adjustments. What reasonable adjustments would you apply when you're applying the instruments to students who have disabilities, who need some help in the way that they're going to be trained and assessed? I've given you an example here. However, you should modify this, contextualize it to whatever students you anticipate as being your cohort. Now, contextualization guidelines. What you want to do is be familiar with the guidelines provided by the training package author as to how to contextualize your unit and what should be contextualized. And the way we do this is we go to the unit of competency and we have a look at the companion volumes. All right, you would follow these links and you'll come to PDF documents typically, and you would open those documents and search for contextualization or contextualize. And whatever you find in there, you would basically copy and paste into this section here. Now, RPL, we've got two questions on RPL. Basically, you need to describe two scenarios. When a candidate claims to have already done the unit with another RTO and has the statement of attainment, well, how are you going to process that? And we've given you an example text here. And secondly, a student who claims that they already know the content, they have all the skills and knowledge of this unit, but they do not have a testament, such as a certificate for or a diploma, and they don't have a statement of attainment for one or more units that includes that unit. So we've given you some sample text here. Now, assessor resources. So the assessor who's going to be using your instruments, you have to decide what resources will he or she need in order to apply these instruments. Now, at minimum, it's got to include a copy of each of the instruments that you've created, right? So clicking this button, and wherever you've chosen an assessment method or instrument in the compliance matrix, it will load those into this field. And you need to then add any other resources that they might need. So for example, there might be some instruction manuals that you might need to include that the student, that the candidate, the assessment candidate has to read and so on. Likewise for the candidate resources, at minimum, it's going to include the instruments that you selected in your compliance matrix, plus anything else that they need to use to successfully complete the instruments that you create. Where will or where can these assessment instruments be applied? You'd specify that here, and if there's any other type of location, you can describe that here. Timing relates to when the assessment would occur. So for example, typically at the end of the training, how long it's likely to require, the order of completion, anything that the assessor needs to know in relating to sequencing and timing. we've provided an example here, but again, you need to modify that to reflect how you intend the instruments to be applied. And finally, review, evaluation, and approval. So you need to identify the stakeholders for your assessment context that you're creating here, and describe how the final assessment tool is going to be approved for use and applied to students. And again, we've provided some sample text, but you need to modify that to your context. Okay, and now we're going to press save, and that saves the information that we've got here. And if you go back to the previous page where you're loading a unit, you'll see that it now appears in the drop-down list. So we've saved this document. The next step, once it's finished loading, the next step, and let's scroll down, is to generate the instruments. Okay, so we've got various controls for the checklist items to move items up or down, delete and so on, which are described here. And what we now have are all of the instruments that you selected in your compliance matrix pre-populated with checklist items, right, that consist of the unit content that you checked. Okay, so in the compliance matrix for observation instrument, we selected these 3 items. Now, it doesn't logically make sense. We just did that at random. The purpose here is just to show you how the process in which we would create these instruments. So, what are the tasks? Firstly, reorder the tasks if needed. Now, if you had a couple of tasks that just logically belong together, so let's say P3 really needed to be at the top because it was combined with PC 1.2. Well, what we can do is we can actually move it up. We might want to move this one down, which we can. We can add a row if there was an item that you wanted to break down into several subparts below it. You can certainly add them. And of course, the delete button deletes those rows. So that's reordering the tasks. Next, if we had 2 tasks that were kind of similar, so often you'll have a PC and a PE, a performance criteria and a performance evidence, that are essentially the same. Well, what you can do is you can highlight, cut them, paste them in here, or perhaps it's duplicated with this existing text, and then of course you would want to include your reference to the second one here, and then delete that blank row. We also need to change the sentence here to make it into a suitable checklist, right? So this is the checklist that the assessor is going through to say, has the candidate done, right? Because it's an observation, has the assessor observed the candidate doing whatever's specified here? So you want to change the sentence to say something like, did the candidate during the above, whatever it was referring to, we need to change that, demonstrate the use of the main features of the selected digital technology. Okay, so the sentence is now correct. Did the candidate do this stuff? Yes. But now we need to make it smart, right? And in particular, we want to make it specific and measurable. Now, there's a problem with this checklist item here in that selected digital technology is just not specific, is it? So we might decide that, okay, in our assessment context, we are going to deliver training on, let's say, 2 different types of technology. Firstly, a photocopier, and we might have a task where the assessment candidate has to scan and auto-email that scan to 1 or more recipients, and they might need to use a PC to email somebody. Well, then we would need to expand this expression here, selected digital technology, and we would replace that by saying, did the candidate demonstrate the main features and functions of the photocopier, i.e. to photocopy and to scan and send a document, and using a PC to email to recipients, and the application of security protocols. Now, security protocols, that's not specific or measurable either. So you would need to expand that to describe, well, what kind of security protocols are to be assessed. Once we finished with the assessment checklist and they follow these suggestions, i.e. the sentence has been changed into a proper checklist type item. You've contextualized it to make sure it makes sense to the cohort you're delivering to, and you've made any fuzzy terms smart, and in particular specific and measurable. The next step is to create the instructions to the candidate. Now, we have a transfer task button here, and the reason why is, if you're assessing a student on something, well, you need to tell them what it is you're assessing. So we're going to transfer these tasks up here, and you'll see that the task has been transferred, as well as the references, right, back to the unit that it's assessing. Now, what you want to do is create a nice scenario to describe to the candidate how they're going to be assessed. So, for example, you might create text to say, for this assessment, you will use a photocopier to firstly photocopy a document, and secondly, you will use its scan function to scan a document and send it to 2 recipients. In particular, you will be assessed for, and then you might list and expand each of those tasks that have been listed above. Okay, so it needs to be a nice scenario or a narrative or a story that leaves the candidate in no doubt as to exactly what they have to do in order to be assessed as competent. Likewise, you need to have instructions to the assessor, and this relates to ensuring that your tools are reliable. In other words, 2 different assessors use the instruments on the same candidate, they're going to come to the same assessment conclusion. So you need to make sure that everything is suitably described for how the assessor is going to apply this assessment instrument. And we've given you some sample text, but obviously you've got to modify this to reflect the context of the assessment that you're doing. And finally, the evidence required and the decision-making rules. In other words, how will you decide whether or not something is appropriate? Now, often that's embedded in the description to the candidates, in the candidate instructions. But we've given you an example here where one of the evidence decision-making rules is a presentation must be at least 30 minutes. So any hard and fast requirements as to whether the evidence is going to be considered satisfactory or not satisfactory. Now, that structure for the observation instrument is essentially repeated in the production of an item, assessment instrument, and in the portfolio of documents. It's essentially the same thing. The questioning instrument, however, is a little bit different. In the questioning instrument, you need to change each of these assessment items, right, which have been extracted from the unit, and change it into a question. Okay, and then here you need to include the model answer or assessor guidance so that the assessor has got really clear instructions as to whatever answer the student gives, whether or not they're going to mark that as satisfactory or not satisfactory. And again, we've got lots of tools here. We can move the order of the questions, we can add a row, delete a row, and so on as needed. And again, we've got instructions to candidates and assessors, for which we've got some sample text and the decision-making rules. Production of an item, that's essentially the same steps as an observation instrument. Likewise for the production of an item instrument. And then the last one is a third-party report. And basically all you need to do is modify whatever accessible item you flagged as being suitable for a third-party report and change the text to make sure that it's consistent with the certification that the certifier is providing. Now, once we finish here, we want to save the work. And once we've saved the work, you'll see that 2 new controls have appeared. And one new control. Now I have both. I can download this the final tool as either a Word and Excel file or as a PDF. Word and Excel is if you have a full license, and if you've got a student license, then only the download of the PDF will be available to you. So let's click on Download PDF. And we'll choose to open it with Adobe. And here is our final assessment tool. Firstly, we've got the assessment plan, and this is in a fairly standard format that reflects industry common usage on how planning looks like. And you'll notice that we've got a watermark here created by Carl at saa.edu.au. And that's for a couple of purposes. Obviously, student authenticity, to make sure that you are indeed the author of this work that you submit to your RTO for assessment. And it also prevents, of course, sharing. Now, one of the implications of that is that the username, the name that you entered when you bought your student license, that can't be subsequently edited. So that's locked in, obviously, so that people can't share their work. All right, well, that concludes this presentation on how to use the assessment tool generator to create assessment tools. I hope that you found it useful.